right, so we are going to get into The Punisher number 11, cover dated September of 1988, on sale May 17th, 1988. Title of the story is called Second Sight, written by Mike Barron, penciled by Whilce Portacio, inked by Scott Williams, lettered by Kenneth Bruzenak, and colored by John Wellington. Now, before we get into the story, let's talk about the main characters that are going to appear in issue number 11. Of course, we got Frank Castle, the Punisher. No introduction needed there. We have a young Mexican woman Frank rescues from the group of violent smugglers. When Frank is temporarily blinded, she becomes his guide and helps direct his gunfire, serving as his literal second sight. We have Pepe, an elderly man living on top of a remote rock formation in the desert. Pepe describes himself as a brujo, a spiritual advisor whom some believe possesses second sight. After saving Frank and the young lady, he challenges Frank's narrow view of the world and encourages him to consider whether he can still reclaim some part of his former life. And finally, the smugglers, a ruthless group transporting people across the Mexican border. Frank begins hunting them after 29 migrants are abandoned inside a truck and left to die. When Frank interferes with their operation and rescues a young woman, the smugglers pursue them into the desert. So as far as the story goes, we open in the heat of northern Mexico, where Frank Castle is staking out a ravine used by smugglers transporting people across the border. Frank has come here because 29 Mexican nationals, men, women, and children, were abandoned inside a truck, left to die of dehydration when their contact never arrived. Frank intends to find the people responsible and deliver his own kind of justice. After spending hours watching the ravine, Frank briefly retreats into a shelter to escape the heat. He falls asleep and wakes near nightfall, angry with himself for losing so much time, but before long, another van enters the ravine and comes to a stop. Looking through his scope, Frank sees two men assaulting a woman, while another man waits nearby. For just a moment, Frank thinks the woman looks like his wife, Maria. He moves in quietly, killing the first man with a knife. As he gets closer, however, he realizes the woman looks nothing like Maria. He cuts down another attacker, but the remaining man raises the alarm. Frank shoots him, grabs the woman, and heads for cover as the smugglers begin firing from the rocks around them. During the escape, a bullet strikes the stone beside Frank's face. The impact sends rock fragments into his eyes, leaving him temporarily blinded. Now Frank has to rely on the woman he just rescued. She leads him through the ravine as the smugglers close in. When Frank realizes they are gaining ground, he tells her to turn him around, guide his arm, and tell him when to fire. For that moment, she becomes what Frank calls his second sight. She directs his gunfire, but a bullet strikes her in the shoulder. She and Frank tumble from the ledge and crash into the ground below. The pursuing smugglers find them lying motionless and assume they are dead. Frank later wakes in the home of an elderly man named Pepe, who lives high atop a massive rock formation in the desert. Pepe tells Frank that the young woman survived and is being cared for by members of his household. Pepe describes himself as a brujo, a spiritual healer and advisor whom some believe possesses second sight. He also seems to understand far more about Frank than Frank has told him. When Frank explains that he punishes criminals, Pepe tells him that he also knows what it means to lose a family. As a child, Pepe watched government troops murder his father and attack his mother. For a time, Pepe wanted revenge, but he eventually chose a different path. He warns Frank that he sees the world through too narrow of a scope. Frank focuses only on the criminal directly in front of him, while Pepe believes all life is connected as part of a greater pattern. Frank soon realizes that something Pepe gave him to drink has altered his perception. Under its influence, he begins reliving the worst day of his life. He sees himself at the park with Maria and their children. He remembers the gunfire between rival criminals and watches his family die all over again. In Frank's mind, that was the moment Frank Castle ceased to exist and the Punisher was born. Pepe tries to convince him that it is not too late to reclaim some part of his humanity. He tells Frank that he's still a family man, he still needs someone to love. The world, Pepe says, already has enough killers. But before Frank can process any of that, the young woman warns them that the smugglers have found Pepe's home. Frank is still hallucinating and occasionally mistakes the woman for Maria. Pepe prepares to defend his home, revealing that among his possessions is an old Spanish cannon. With limited weapons and the smugglers approaching, Pepe loads the cannon with nails, gravel, and anything else that might turn it into a devastating blast. Frank attempts to lure the smugglers closer by claiming that Pepe has a fortune in gold hidden on the property. As the men begin climbing toward them, Frank suddenly sees, or believes he sees, his dead wife directing his attention toward the opposite side of the rock. Pepe insists that there is only one way up, but Frank is convinced Maria is warning him. He struggles to turn the cannon around even as Pepe tries to stop him from aiming away from the visible attackers. Frank, however, fires. The cannon blast reveals that another group of smugglers had found a hidden route and was approaching from behind. The shot tears through them and saves Frank and Pepe from being ambushed. The remaining smugglers attack. Pepe uses his rifle to take one down, but he is shot and killed in the fighting. That leaves Frank facing the final gunman. The smuggler demands to know Frank's name before killing him. Frank simply answers, "I'm the Punisher." Before the man can fire, the young woman he had saved drives a pitchfork into the smuggler's back, saving Frank's life just as Frank had saved hers. With the battle over, Frank is left wondering whether anything he experienced was real. Was Maria truly guiding him? Was it only the drug, or was his mind seeing something his eyes could not? Overcome with emotion, Frank begins to cry. He asks the young woman her name. She tells him it is Maria. Frank quietly tells her that Maria was also his wife's name. So yeah, overall, I thought The Punisher issue number 11 was an interesting change of pace here. Coming directly after that crossover with Daredevil, which had a lot going on and was much more action-heavy, this one slows everything down, kind of gives us a self-contained story out in the desert. And I think we probably needed something like that. It doesn't feel like a completely random detour, but it feels like a one-off adventure. Frank comes into this situation, meets a handful of characters, deals with the smugglers, and then moves on. Nothing here feels like it is going to dramatically change the direction of the series. The opening gives Frank a very clear reason to get involved. 29 people, men, women, and children, were abandoned inside a truck and left to die of dehydration. That immediately tells you the kind of people that Frank is hunting. These smugglers are willing to leave an entire truck full of human beings to die when something goes wrong. So yes, they absolutely qualify for Frank Castle's particular form of justice. Now, one thing I liked was Frank being temporarily blinded. The Punisher is an incredibly capable person, but he's still human. With no superpowers, sometimes something completely accidental can put him in a serious disadvantage. And this isn't a bullet that actually strikes him either. I mean, this is a shot, and it just hits the rocks beside him, causing debris to damage his eyes. Now that gives the young woman a real role in the story. Frank has to trust her to lead him through the ravine, point him in the right direction, and tell him where to fire. She literally becomes the second sight, which is a clever way of working the title into the action. Then we meet Pepe, who is where the issue starts to bring in mystical elements. Pepe calls himself a brujo, claims that some people believe he has second sight, and gives Frank something to drink that sends him into this hallucinatory state. I would not say Pepe is a deeply developed character here. He's mostly there to challenge Frank's worldview. He's a strange, mystical old man out in the desert who looks at Frank and tells him that he is seeing the world through too narrow of a scope. Pepe believes everything is connected. He believes Frank is still a family man and still needs somebody to love. And maybe it's not too late for him to step away from being the Punisher. I don't believe that, though. Frank is way too deep in this path by now. There's still glimpses of his humanity, and this issue definitely shows that the pain of losing his family is still just right there beneath the surface. But I don't think he can simply decide to stop. Even if Frank tried to walk away, live a normal life, I think something would happen that would drag him right back into the war. The hallucinatory sequence works within the story because it forces Frank to relive the moment that created him. We get his origin again, the picnic in the park, the mobsters opening fire, and his wife and children being killed. In some ways, this is another elaborate retelling of the Punisher's origin. But because Frank is under the influence of whatever Pepe gave him, it makes sense that his mind would return to the worst moment of his life. He's experiencing this trauma all over again. Now, the best visual moment in the issue, in my opinion, comes from the sequence where Frank is seen as kind of like this healthy man, a bit of a smile on his face, and then he says that Frank Castle had died and the Punisher was born. We go from Frank's face to this image of a skull, a skeleton. And then we get a red outline of the Punisher with that skull across his chest. Beautiful piece of visual storytelling there. It shows us that in Frank's mind, the man he once was truly died in that park. I do like the ambiguity that surrounds Maria. Early in the story, Frank sees the young woman and briefly thinks she looks like his wife. Then when he gets closer, he realizes that she doesn't look like Maria at all. But once the drug begins to affect him, he starts confusing the two of them again. He believes he can see or hear his wife guiding him. We never actually get to see the ghost of Maria either here. There's no transparent figure standing beside Frank and pointing into the distance. We only see Frank looking at something outside the panel and reacting to it. So that kind of leaves the door open. Maybe it's entirely the drug. Maybe Frank's instincts are working beneath the hallucination, and his mind gives him those instincts in the form of his wife. Or maybe Maria truly is reaching out to him from somewhere beyond the grave. The story never really gives us a firm answer, and I think that's definitely the right choice here. The strongest moment involving the ambiguity comes with the cannon. Pepe insists there is only one path onto the rock, but Frank believes Maria is telling him to turn the cannon around and fire in the opposite direction. Pepe thinks Frank is out of his mind, but Frank is completely convinced. He turns the cannon, he fires it, and discovers the smugglers had another route and were sneaking up behind them. So whatever Frank experienced, it saved their lives. Whether that was a supernatural warning or Frank somehow putting the pieces together while under the influence, it's kind of left up to the reader. And as ridiculous as the giant antique cannon may look on the cover, I thought the story justified it well enough. It's an old weapon Pepe has on the property. They are trapped with limited resources, and they can only load it with whatever they can find. They are simply making do with what they have. Pepe eventually picks up his rifle and helps defend his home, and I don't think that undermines this message. These men are coming to kill him and everyone with him. Pepe may believe there is more to life than revenge and killing, but that does not mean he is going to stand there and let these people murder him. His death, though, didn't really have much of a tremendous impact on me. I mean, we don't know him long enough for that. He's an interesting figure, useful part of the story, but when he dies, he's still just mostly Pepe, strange old man in the desert who saved Frank and gave him something that made him see things. The young woman saving Frank with the pitchfork was much more satisfying. Frank saved her earlier, and now she gets the opportunity to save him. And then we reach the ending, where Frank asks her name and she tells him that it's Maria. That's obviously an enormous coincidence, and it could have easily felt too melodramatic, but I liked it. The entire issue has been connecting this young woman to Frank's wife. Frank mistakes her for Maria. She becomes his second sight, and then he believes his wife guides him to fire that cannon in the right direction. Finding out the woman is also named Maria brings all of that together. And when Frank sheds a tear, he believes that Maria may have reached out and saved him. Then the woman standing in front of him, the woman he kept confusing with his wife, reveals that her name is Maria too. For just a moment, all of these strange coincidences and hallucinations connect. Just like Pepe said, everything is connected. That may also be the strongest interpretation of the second sight title. Maria becomes Frank's literal second sight when he's blinded, and Pepe supposedly possesses second sight as a brujo, but Frank is also briefly allowed to see beyond his normal worldview. For most of his life now, Frank sees criminals, victims, targets, and punishment. During this experience, he is forced to look backward at his family, inward at his grief, and perhaps even beyond the physical world. The experience does not change him, and he is still going to be the Punisher when the next issue begins, but for this one story, the book lets him step outside of that and confront the emotional wound underneath everything he does. As far as where this ranks among the first 11 issues, I would probably put it somewhere in the bottom half. I don't think it's a bad issue. The artwork is fantastic. Mystical ambiguity's kind of interesting here. There are several clever ideas built around the phrase second sight, but it's still a one-off story and doesn't feel especially important to the larger Punisher run. In many ways, it's another version of Frank reliving his origin and being reminded of the family he lost. Now, the biggest thing that stayed with me all these years was the cover. I remember buying this issue at 7-Eleven near my grandma's house when I had to have been 10 years old. I remember Frank holding what looked like an actual cannon. I thought it was a bazooka at first, but now reading the story again, yeah, it's an actual cannon. I remember that cover and that image far more clearly than I remember anything that ever happened in the book. Reading it now, I appreciate what Mike Barron, Whilce Portacio, and Scott Williams were doing more than I did back then. There's more psychological and emotional material here than I remembered, but I can also understand why the story itself didn't stick with me. It's a decent Punisher story with an unusual atmosphere, some strong artwork, and an interesting supernatural question at its center. But that cover for me, that's the real icon.